Xaeroth isn't just deadly. It's designed to kill anything human. A gravity 3 times Earth's. Air so dense it chokes. Ground so unstable it tears steel apart like paper. No alien species believed we could survive there, much less walk into a dying facility at the heart of a planetary disaster, just to save one of theirs. But we're human. We do the impossible. We don't wait for rescue. We become it. And one man, broken but unyielding, stepped into hell with nothing but an experimental suit, and the will to not let anyone die on his watch. If you believe in the power of human grit, hit like, smash that subscribe button, and join the fight. This is HFY, where humanity always finds a way. The planet Xaeroth stretched out like a brutal, untamed wilderness under a thick, copper-red atmosphere. Its air hung heavy, dense with gases that shimmered faintly in the dim light, while its gravity, 3 times that of Earth, pressed down relentlessly on everything below. Violent gravity storms tore across its surface at random, ripping apart the rugged plains and leaving deep craters where the pressure could crush steel into dust. Jagged hills rose and fell, their edges worn smooth by the ceaseless forces that shaped this unforgiving world. The sky churned with amber clouds, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, a constant reminder of Xaeroth's raw, untamed power. On this hostile planet lived the Xaerothians, a species as striking as they were resilient. Their bodies were clad in an exoskeleton of shimmering silic compounds, a natural armor that gleamed under the faint light. Their scales shifted colors with their emotions, emerald when calm, deep crimson when angered, catching the eye like living jewels. Large, luminous eyes, glowing softly, pierced through the planet's thick, misty haze, adapted to see where humans would stumble blindly. Their forms were tall and slender, with unexpected curves softening the areas where scales gave way to smooth, unprotected skin, the hollow of their necks, the dip of their lower bellies. When they spoke, their voices hummed with resonant sound waves, a vibration that seemed to dance through the air, both alien and strangely alluring. A team of researchers from across the galaxy had come to Xaeroth, drawn by its mysteries. Humans and Xaerothians worked side by side, their mission clear: to study the planet's crushing gravity and unlock secrets of adaptation that could bridge their species. The outpost they built stood as a fragile beacon of cooperation, its reinforced walls trembling under the weight of the environment. Yet not everyone approved. Whispers of extremist factions among the Xaerothians lingered in the air. Those who saw the humans as intruders, weaklings unfit for their world. The tensions simmered beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, but felt by those who paid attention. Among the newcomers was Liam Blake, a human engineer fresh from Earth. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years spent wrestling with machines on hostile planets. Jupiter's moons, Titan's mines, places where survival demanded grit. He stepped off the transport shuttle, his boots sinking slightly into Xaeroth's dense soil, and felt the gravity tug at his bones. His dark hair clung to his forehead with sweat, and his sharp green eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the alien expanse. Before arriving, he'd reviewed the team's files, and one had stopped him cold. Elora, a Xaerothian scientist. Her image flickered on the screen, scales glinting like polished jade, hips curving in a way that seemed almost too human, too inviting. He wondered how her cold, smooth skin would feel under his rough fingers, a thought that sent his pulse racing despite the weight pressing down on him. He shook it off, adjusting his gear, but the image lingered in his mind. Liam wasn't the only one adjusting. The human crew moved slowly, their suits humming with compensators to ease the strain, while the Xaerothians glided with a grace born of evolution. The outposts buzzed with activity, scientists calibrating sensors, engineers reinforcing structures against the next inevitable storm. Liam hauled a crate of tools toward the main bay, his muscles straining under the gravity, when a voice cut through the hum of machinery. "You the new guy, huh?" Mara, a wiry human engineer with short-cropped hair and a smirk, leaned against a console nearby. She wiped grease from her hands, eyeing him up and down. "Heard you've tamed worse than this hellhole." Liam grunted, setting the crate down with a thud. Titan was no picnic. "This place feels like it's trying to flatten me, for fun." Mara chuckled, stepping closer. "Wait till you meet the locals. That Elora? She's a looker, scales and all. But you're dying to see if she's as cold as she sounds." Liam's jaw tightened, but a faint grin tugged at his lips. "Just here to work, Mara." She snorted, clapping his shoulder. "Sure you are. Keep telling yourself that." The exchange lightened the air, and Liam turned back to his task, the outpost alive around him. He caught snippets of conversation, the Xaerothians' resonant voices blending with the sharper tones of human speech. Elora's name came up often, her work on gravity anomalies praised in hushed, reverent tones. He hadn't met her yet, but he could already picture her standing among the team, her luminous eyes scanning data, her presence commanding attention. The outpost itself was a marvel of engineering, its domed roof reinforced with alloys designed to withstand Xaeroth's fury. Inside, the air was filtered cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Liam ran his hands over a control panel, checking its readings, his mind half on the task and half on the Xaerothian woman he'd yet to encounter. He'd worked with aliens before, hulking miners on Titan, wiry traders from Mars. But something about Elora felt different, dangerous in a way he couldn't name. Her scales, her voice, the way her body moved in the footage. It stirred something primal in him, a curiosity he couldn't shake. Outside, the wind howled, carrying faint tremors through the ground. The team barely noticed, accustomed to the planet's restless nature. Liam stepped to a viewport, peering out at the coppery haze. Somewhere beyond the outpost, Elora was already at work, her research station deeper in the basin, closer to the heart of Xaeroth's mysteries. He flexed his hands, feeling the ache of the gravity in his joints, and wondered what it would be like to stand beside her, to hear that resonant voice in person. Mara's teasing echoed in his head as he turned back to the panel, his fingers brushing a wrench, the faint clink of metal blending with the outpost's steady hum. The calm hum of the outpost shattered without warning. A sudden surge of gravity ripped through Xaeroth's surface, a wave so powerful it twisted the air itself. The research facility, a sturdy complex of reinforced steel and composite walls, buckled like paper toys under the onslaught. Beams snapped with deafening cracks, and entire sections of the structure collapsed inward, swallowed by the planet's relentless pull. Dust and debris spiraled into the copper-red sky, the ground trembling as if Xaeroth itself roared in fury. Alarms blared through the outpost, their shrill wails cutting through the chaos as the human and Xaerothian crew scrambled to make sense of the disaster unfolding beyond the viewport. Deep beneath the wreckage, Elora fought to stay upright. The Xaerothian scientist, along with her team of researchers, was trapped in a narrow underground lab, its walls groaning under the crushing pressure. Sparks flew from shattered consoles, casting flickering light across her emerald scales, which shimmered faintly even in the dimness. Her luminous eyes darted to her colleagues, some pinned under fallen equipment, others clawing at the sealed exit. The air grew thick, the gravity pressing down like an invisible fist, and she braced herself against the table, her slender frame tense with determination. Her resonant voice hummed low, directing the others to secure what they could, though the odds felt impossibly slim. Back at the outpost, panic spread like wildfire. Rescue teams mobilized, but their efforts crumbled as quickly as the facility had. Standard drones and exosuits, built to withstand Xaeroth's normal gravity, malfunctioned under the freakish pressure, their circuits frying or frames crumpling. Human engineers shouted over the noise, their faces pale, while Xaerothians exchanged rapid, vibrating tones of alarm. Liam stood near the command center, his hands clenched into fists, watching the screens flicker with static. The situation was dire, hopeless, some whispered, and the weight of it settled into his chest, heavier than the planet's pull. He'd seen disasters before, but nothing like this, nothing that turned solid ground into a weapon. Amid the chaos, Ellora's name surfaced again, this time with urgency. She was down there, somewhere in that collapsing tomb of metal and stone, leading the gravity research team. Liam's mind flashed to the video he'd watched before landing. A briefing where she'd explained her work on gravitational anomalies. Her scales had caught the light as she moved, her body lean and graceful, a stark contrast to the cold precision of her words. That voice, though, had stayed with him, deep and resonant, vibrating through the recording like a pulse. It had sent a strange heat curling through him, an itch he couldn't scratch, even now as he stood surrounded by shouting voices and blaring alerts. He hadn't met her, but the thought of her trapped below gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. The command center buzzed with frantic activity. A human officer barked orders, his face slick with sweat, while a Xaerothian technician relayed data in a low, thrumming tone. The surge hit triple Xaeroth's baseline, the technician said, scales shifting to a dull gray. No equipment can function down there. Liam stepped closer to the screens, his green eyes narrowing as he studied the grainy feed from a surviving drone. The facility's outer shell was a mangled ruin, its lower levels buried under tons of debris. He could almost feel the pressure himself, the way it would squeeze the air from his lungs, grind his bones to dust. Yet Ellora was alive. He had to believe that, her sharp mind racing to find a way out. In the underground lab, Ellora's hands moved swiftly over a cracked console, her claws tapping against the surface. She muttered calculations under her breath, the sound a soft hum that steadied her team even as the walls creaked ominously. A younger Xaerothian, his scales a pale blue from fear, stumbled toward her. "We're losing power," he said, his voice trembling through the air. Ellora's eyes flicked to him, glowing bright in the shadows. "Focus on the backup cells," she replied, her tone firm but laced with that strange, captivating resonance. She straightened, her body aching under the strain, and wiped a bead of moisture from her brow, a rare sign of weakness for her kind. Above, Liam's thoughts churned. He'd faced impossible odds before, crawling through Titan's collapsing tunnels, dragging crewmates to safety, but this was different. The outpost crew argued over options, their voices rising in desperation. A human pilot shook her head, muttering about fried engines, while a Xaerothian engineer gestured helplessly at a pile of broken gear. Liam's gaze drifted back to the screen, where the drone's feed showed a faint heat signature pulsing beneath the rubble. Ellora, he thought, picturing her again, those jade scales, that live form bent over her work. The heat from the video memory flared in him once more, a distraction he pushed aside as he flexed his hands, testing their strength against the ache of Xaeroth's gravity. The outpost trembled with a distant aftershock, the floor vibrating underfoot. Liam moved to a nearby table, grabbing a tablet to pull up the facility schematics. Lines and grids glowed on the screen, mapping out the underground labs where Ellora and her team were trapped. He traced a finger along the layout, his calloused skin catching on the smooth surface, his mind racing with half-formed plans. Around him, the crew's voices faded into a dull roar, the weight of the crisis pressing in from all sides. Outside, the amber sky darkened as another storm brewed, its low rumble echoing through the walls, and Liam's grip tightened on the tablet, his eyes fixed on the flickering data. The chaos in the outpost reached a fever pitch, voices overlapping in a frantic tangle of fear and frustration. Liam stood over the tablet, its glowing schematics reflecting in his sharp green eyes, his jaw tight with focus. The heat signatures from the buried lab pulsed faintly on the screen, proof that Ellora and her team still clung to life. He set the tablet down with a quiet thud, the weight of Xaeroth's gravity pulling at his every move, and turned to the command center. "I'm going down there," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Heads swiveled toward him, disbelief etched on human and Xaerothian faces alike. The risk was insane. Crushing death waited below, but Liam's broad shoulders squared with a resolve that silenced the room for a fleeting moment. From the trapped lab, Ellara's voice crackled through a patchy comms link, her words distorted but unmistakable. "A human? You'll never survive this," she said, her tone icy, edged with skepticism. The resonant hum of her voice vibrated through the speakers, low and commanding, and Liam felt it ripple down his spine. He pictured her lips moving as she spoke, smooth and scaled, trembling faintly with each sound wave, a thought that tightened his chest despite the urgency. "Your tech isn't built for it," she pressed, her doubt sharp. Liam leaned closer to the comms unit, his breath steady. "It doesn't need to be. I'll make it work." A pause stretched between them, her luminous eyes likely narrowing in the darkness below, until she relented with a curt, "Do what you must." The connection fizzled out, but her voice lingered in his ears, cool yet magnetic. Liam moved to the equipment bay, his steps heavy under the planet's pull, and retrieved the prototype gravity suit from a sealed locker. The suit was a patchwork of innovation, plates of countergrav tech stitched into a flexible frame, untested beyond simulations. He pulled it on, the material hugging his body tightly, pressing against his muscled arms and chest like a second skin. His fingers traced the seams, and for a fleeting second, he imagined Ellara's clawed hands running over the same spots, checking the fit with scientific precision. The image sent a shiver through him, a mix of anticipation and something hotter, and he shook his head to refocus, securing the helmet with a click. The suit hummed to life, a faint vibration easing the strain on his joints, though he knew it wouldn't hold forever. The crew around him buzzed with concern, their warnings sharp and insistent. Mara, the wiry engineer from earlier, grabbed his arm as he adjusted the suit straps. "You're nuts, Blake," she said, her eyes wide. "That gravity'll turn you to paste before you hit the basin." A Xaerothian technician, scales dulled to a nervous gray, chimed in with a thrumming voice. "Even our strongest frames failed. You're too fragile for this." Liam met their gazes, his expression unyielding, though a flicker of curiosity danced in his mind. Ellara's alien body, so different from his own, waiting down there. "I've handled worse," he replied, his tone calm but firm, and pulled free from Mara's grip to finish his prep. The command center dimmed as the amber storm outside thickened, casting long shadows across the floor. Liam's thoughts churned, torn between the mission and the woman he'd yet to meet. Ellara's skepticism gnawed at him, but so did the pull of her presence, those jade scales, that resonant voice he could still feel in his bones. He'd faced death before, dragged himself through collapsing mines and burning wrecks, but this felt personal in a way he couldn't explain. The crew's protests faded into background noise as he ran diagnostics on the suit, lights blinking green across the control panel strapped to his wrist. It wasn't perfect, glitches flickered in the readings, but it would have to do. Mara hovered nearby, her hands on her hips, watching him with a mix of worry and grudging respect. "You're really doing this for her, aren't you?" she muttered, low enough that only he could hear. Liam didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched, betraying a hint of the truth. He pictured Ellara again, trapped in that crumbling lab, her slender form braced against the chaos. What would it be like to stand beside her, to feel the cool brush of her scales against his skin? The thought stirred him, a quiet heat beneath his focus, and he pushed it down, tightening the suit straps until they bit into his shoulders. The Xaerothian technician approached, holding out a small comms device. "For when you reach her," he said, his voice a deep hum. "If you reach her." Liam took it, nodding, and clipped it to his helmet. The weight of their doubts pressed against him, but so did his own stubborn drive, and that flicker of intrigue about the alien scientist he was risking everything for. He flexed his hands inside the suit's gloves, testing their grip, and felt the faint buzz of the countergrav plates kicking in. The outpost shuddered again, a distant rumble rolling through the walls, and Liam stepped toward the launch bay, his boots thudding softly on the metal floor, the comms device blinking faintly as he adjusted its settings. The launch bay doors hissed open, and Liam's drop pod hurtled toward Xaeroth's tortured surface. The amber sky swallowed him whole, the planet's churning clouds blurring past the tiny viewport as gravity clawed at the craft. The pod shuddered violently, its reinforced shell groaning under the strain, and then slammed into the ground with a bone-rattling crash. Dust billowed around the crumpled landing site, and Liam grunted as the impact jolted through him. The gravity suit whirred, its plates straining to counter the force, but a sharp beep signaled trouble. Cracks spiderwebbed across the control panel on his wrist. The suit tightened against his skin, squeezing his chest and thighs, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined Ellara's clawed hands gliding over him, sharp yet delicate, adjusting the plates with a scientist's care. The thought sent a jolt through him, hotter than the suit's failing circuits, and he shook it off, forcing the hatch open with a grunt. Stepping onto Xaeroth's soil felt like wading through molten lead. The gravity pressed down, relentless and cruel, each wave crashing over him like a tidal surge. Liam's boots sank into the cracked earth, his muscles bulging against the suit as he took his first step. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down his face, and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. Every movement was a fight, a raw display of strength that pulsed through his frame, primal, unyielding. The landscape stretched out in chaos. Twisted metal spires jutted from the ground, remnants of the facility warped by the disaster, while the air shimmered with gravitational distortions. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward, the suit's hum faltering as another wave hit, forcing him to brace against a jagged rock. Something strange was happening inside him. The crushing weight should have broken him, snapped his bones, collapsed his lungs, but it didn't. His muscles ached, yes, but they were changing, growing denser, harder, as if Xaeroth itself was forging him anew. Liam flexed his arm, feeling the power ripple beneath his skin, and a flicker of wonder cut through the pain. What would Ellora think of this? A human, now rivaling the strength of her own kind, standing tall where others would fall. He pictured her luminous eyes widening, her scaled hands tracing his transformed frame in curiosity, or something more. The idea fueled him, driving his next step, his body adapting faster than he'd ever thought possible. The comms crackled in his helmet, Mara's voice breaking through the static. "Liam, you're still alive? Readings show the suit's at 60%. Watch yourself." He didn't reply, too focused on the ruined facility looming ahead, its skeletal remains half buried in a crater. Heat signatures blinked on his wrist display, faint but steady, guiding him toward the survivors. The first Xaerothian he found lay pinned under a fallen beam, scales dulled to a sickly gray. Liam crouched, his enhanced strength surging as he heaved the debris aside, the metal screeching in protest. The alien gasped, luminous eyes blinking up at him in shock. "A human," the Xaerothian rasped, voice thrumming weakly. Liam helped him stand, steadying the trembling figure. "Where's Ellora?" he asked, his tone sharp. The survivor pointed deeper into the wreckage, toward the lower labs, and Liam nodded, moving on without pause. Two more Xaerothians emerged from the rubble as he pressed forward, their scales scratched but intact. Liam guided them to a stable outcrop, his hands firm on their arms, their cool, smooth surfaces a stark contrast to his heated skin. Each rescue sharpened his focus, but Ellora remained elusive, a phantom driving him deeper into the chaos. He imagined finding her, her lithe body pressed against his in some tight, crumbling corner, her scales brushing his chest through the torn suit, sending a shiver down his spine. The thought was vivid, electric, and he clenched his jaw, shoving it aside as another gravity wave rolled through, forcing him to his knees. The suit sparked, its plates flickering, but he hauled himself up, his breath heavy, determination burning brighter than the pain. The facility's remains loomed darker now, its corridors twisted into a maze of jagged metal and shattered walls. Liam navigated the debris, his boots crunching over broken glass, the air thick with dust and the faint tang of ozone. His wrist display beeped, more signatures, deeper still, and he quickened his pace, muscles straining against the relentless pull. The Xaerothians he'd saved trailed behind, their resonant voices murmuring thanks, but his mind was elsewhere. Elora was close. He could feel it, an instinct he couldn't name. The suit's countergrav stuttered again, and he adjusted it manually, fingers fumbling over the controls, sweat stinging his eyes. He'd trained for high-gravity worlds, but this was beyond anything he'd faced. Yet his body held, adapting with every punishing step. A faint sound reached him through the helmet. A low, rhythmic hum, unmistakably Xaerothian. Liam rounded a collapsed wall, his heart pounding, and spotted a sealed hatch half buried under rubble. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the debris with gloved hands, the suit's servos whining under the effort. The hum grew louder, a voice filtering through the chaos, and he froze for a split second, recognizing its cadence. Elora. She was there, just beyond the hatch, and the realization hit him like a punch. He pictured her on the other side, scales glinting in the dark, her slender form braced against the weight, waiting for rescue. His hands moved faster, tearing at the wreckage, the suit's plates grinding against his skin as he worked. The survivors watched from a distance, their glowing eyes fixed on him, a human defying their world's wrath. Liam's muscles burned, his breath fogging the helmet's visor, but he didn't stop. The hatch's edge came into view, its surface dented but intact, and he wedged a tool under it, prying with all his strength. Metal screeched, bending under his grip, and a sliver of darkness opened beneath. The hum of Elora's voice grew clearer, vibrating through the air, and Liam's pulse raced, not just from exertion, but from the thought of her so near, her alien presence pulling him like a magnet. He leaned closer, peering into the gap, his gloved fingers brushing the hatch's cold surface as he strained to widen it further. Liam's tool finally forced the hatch wide enough, and with a final heave, he pried it open, the metal screeching in surrender. Darkness yawned below, pierced by faint flickers of emergency lights, and he slid through the gap, landing heavily in the cramped lab. Dust swirled around him, the air thick with the hum of failing systems, and his eyes adjusted to the dimness. There she was, Elora, bent over a cracked console, her slender form taut with focus. Her emerald scales caught the weak glow, shimmering like wet jade, and her claws danced across the controls, salvaging data from the dying machine. She turned at the sound of his boots, her luminous eyes locking onto him, and a cold breath escaped her, brushing his neck through the suit's torn collar. His hand brushed her hip as he steadied himself, where scales thinned to soft, smooth skin, and a chill raced through his fingers, his heart pounding harder than the gravity could explain. "Ew," Elora said, her resonant voice sharp with disbelief, vibrating through the tight space. "A human shouldn't be here." Liam straightened, his suit creaking, and met her gaze. "I'm here now. Let's get you out." Her eyes narrowed, scales glinting as she stepped closer, the room's confines forcing them together. "This isn't a simple rescue," she snapped, reaching past him for a flickering screen. Her body pressed against his, her chest, armored by its natural shell, grazing his arm with a subtle pressure that sent a jolt through him. A faint scent wafted from her, metallic yet floral, like wildflowers forged in steel, and it clouded his focus for a heartbeat. He shook it off, growling, "Then tell me what's worth dying for down here." She hesitated, her claws pausing mid-motion, and the air between them crackled with tension. Their argument flared in the cramped lab, voices bouncing off the warped walls. Elora insisted on saving the data, her tone cold but edged with urgency, while Liam pushed for evacuation, his frustration mounting. "We don't have time," he said, leaning in, their faces inches apart. She shoved past him to reach the console's far side, her scales brushing his chest, and he caught her arm, pulling her back. "Stop risking your life for this," he barked. She twisted free, her body sliding against his in the tight space, and glared up at him, her breath cool against his jaw. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice thrumming low, almost hypnotic. "This is bigger than us." The contact lingered in his senses, the hard edge of her scales, the soft give where they met skin, and he fought to keep his mind on her words. Ellara's gaze shifted, anger flashing in her luminous eyes, and she turned back to the console, her claws tapping furiously. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Someone triggered a gravity device, deliberately." The revelation hit Liam like a punch, and he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Who?" he demanded, his tone hard. Her scales darkened to a deep green, fury radiating from her, and she met his stare, her eyes blazing. "I don't know yet, but the data proves it." The intensity in her expression stirred him, a wild urge to pull her close and ease that rage surging through him. But he held back, his hands clenching at his sides. She was fierce, unyielding, and it drew him in deeper than he'd expected. Liam exhaled, his resolve hardening. "Then we get the data and get out, together." He moved to help, reaching for a loose cable near her feet, and as he stood, his hand grazed the soft patch beneath her neck, where scales parted like silk. The cool, slick feel sent a shiver up his arm, and he froze for a split second, their eyes locking. Ellara's breath hitched, her scales flickering briefly, but she said nothing, turning back to the screen with a tight nod. "Fine," she muttered, her voice softer now, still resonating through him. The accidental touch lingered in his mind, a quiet thrill beneath the urgency, and he forced his focus to the task, plugging the cable into a backup port. The lab trembled around them, a low groan echoing from the walls as another gravity wave pulsed through. Ellara's team, 3 Xaerothians huddled near the back, watched in silence, their glowing eyes darting between their leader and the human who defied their world. Liam worked beside her, their movements cramped but synchronized, his arm brushing hers as they salvaged the last fragments of data. That scent, metal and wildflowers, filled his lungs again, and he caught himself staring at the curve of her neck, the way her scales shifted with each breath. She glanced at him, catching his look, and her eyes narrowed slightly, though a faint shimmer in her scales hinted at something unspoken. The console beeped, a green light flashing, data secured, and Ellara pulled a small crystal drive free, clutching it tightly. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. Liam nodded, stepping back, but the space was too small, and his hand brushed her hip again, that soft patch sending another chill through him. "We need to move," he said, his tone rougher than intended, masking the heat creeping up his neck. She turned, her body close enough that he could feel the coolness radiating from her, and pointed to a sealed door across the lab. "That's our way out, the maintenance tunnels." Her eyes lingered on him, sharp and searching, as if weighing his strength against the danger ahead. The Xaerothians at the back stirred, one limping forward, his scales scratched and dull. "He's not like us," he murmured, his voice thrumming with awe, echoing the other's sentiments from above. Ellara shot him a glance, then looked back at Liam, her expression unreadable. The lab shuddered again, dust cascading from the ceiling, and Liam moved to the door, testing its frame with a firm push. It held, locked tight, and he pulled a tool from his belt, his hand steady despite the ache in his muscles. Ellara stepped up beside him, her claws hovering near the lock, and together they worked to pry it open, their shoulders brushing in the tight space, the faint hum of her voice guiding their efforts as the walls creaked around them. The maintenance door gave way with a grinding screech, and Liam shoved it open, ushering Ellara and her team into the tunnel beyond. The lab trembled behind them, dust raining from the ceiling as the walls buckled under another gravity surge. They barely had time to catch their breath before a new sound cut through the chaos, sharp, metallic clangs echoing from the upper levels, followed by shouts in harsh Xaerothian tones. Ellara's scales darkened, her luminous eyes narrowing. "They found us," she said, her voice thrumming with urgency. Liam glanced back, catching the glint of armored figures descending through the rubble. Extremists, their intent clear in the weapons they brandished. "Move!" he barked, pushing the group forward into the narrow passage, the air growing thick with danger. The tunnel was a claustrophobic maze, its walls slick with condensation and jagged with protruding metal. Liam took the lead, his suit's flickering lights casting erratic shadows, while Elora stayed close, guiding her limping team. The extremists' footsteps grew louder, their resonant curses vibrating through the stone, and a sudden burst of energy scorched the wall behind them. Liam spun, spotting a gap in the tunnel, a tight crevice barely wide enough for one. "Here!" he shouted, grabbing Elora's arm and pulling her into the space. Her body pressed against his, her hard scales scraping his chest through the suit's rips, but the soft, unprotected skin of her lower belly met his hip, cold and smooth. The contrast sent a shiver through him, his breath turning heavy, and in the dimness, their eyes locked, hers glowing, his sharp with adrenaline, a silent pulse passing between them. The moment broke as the extremist lights swept past, their voices snarling in frustration. Liam held Elora still, his arm firm around her, her coolness seeping into his overheated skin. The tunnel quieted, the pursuers moving further down, and he eased his grip, though she didn't pull away immediately. Her team huddled nearby, catching their breath, and Elora turned to Liam, her claws brushing his chest as she steadied herself. "You're still alive," she murmured, her voice a low hum, and she pressed her fingers near his collar, where the suit gaped open. Her sharp tips grazed his bare skin, a jolt like electricity sparking through him, and she paused, feeling his racing pulse. "Your body's so warm," she whispered, the resonance in her tone curling around him, inviting and strange, her luminous eyes flickering with something unspoken. Liam swallowed, his throat dry, but he didn't flinch from her touch. "Keeps me going," he said, his voice rough, a faint grin tugging at his lips. Elora's hand lingered, sliding down to his shoulder, and her claws traced the hard lines of his muscles, denser now, forged by Xaeroth's relentless pull. "You're changing," she said, her voice softening, curiosity mingling with a quiet awe. Her fingers pressed lightly, testing his strength, and her scales shimmered briefly, betraying a flicker of intrigue. He felt it too, the shift in his body, the raw power coiling beneath his skin, and her touch stirred a heat that wasn't just from the chase. "Good thing," he replied, meeting her gaze, "or we'd be dead already." The tunnel stretched ahead, its walls narrowing further, and they moved on, the extremist distant shouts still echoing behind. Elora stayed close, her steps graceful despite the strain, while her team struggled to keep pace, their scales dulled with exhaustion. Liam's suit beeped, a warning of failing power, but his body compensated, each stride stronger than the last. The air grew colder, the tunnel dipping deeper underground, and he glanced at Elora, her form outlined by the faint glow of her eyes. She'd risked everything for that data crystal, and now he was risking everything for her, a bond forming in the heat of survival, unspoken but palpable. A sudden tremor shook the passage, loose rocks tumbling from above, and Liam pulled Elora aside, shielding her as debris clattered around them. Her team ducked, one crying out as a stone grazed his arm, and Liam steadied Elora, his hands on her shoulders. Her scales felt cool under his palms, but the softness beneath them, where her neck met her chest, brushed his fingers, sending another shiver through him. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her breath quickening, and for a moment her hand rested on his chest again, claws grazing the edge of his torn suit. "You're reckless," she said, her tone sharp but laced with something warmer, her eyes searching his face in the dark. The extremist lights flashed again, closer now, and Liam urged the group forward, his arm brushing Elora's as they ran. The tunnel twisted, splitting into two paths, and Elora pointed left, her voice firm. "This way, it loops back to the surface." Liam trusted her, guiding the others as the sounds of pursuit grew louder, boots pounding the stone. The air thickened with dust, the walls trembling with each gravity pulse, and Liam's muscles burned, his adaptation pushing him beyond human limits. Elora kept pace, her resilience matching his, and he caught her glancing at him, her eyes tracing the sweat-slicked lines of his neck, the power in his frame, a look that lingered longer than necessary. They reached a wider section, a hollowed-out chamber where the tunnel briefly opened, and Liam signaled a pause, his chest heaving. Elora knelt beside him, checking her team, but her attention drifted back to him. She reached out, her claws brushing his arm again, testing the dense muscle beneath. "This shouldn't be possible," she said, her voice a mix of science and wonder, her touch lingering as if drawn to his heat. The Xaerothians watched, their glowing eyes wide, one whispering to another, "He's more than human now." Liam flexed his hand, feeling the strength surge, and met Elora's gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. Danger had forged them closer, their differences blurring in the shadows. The chamber rumbled, a distant explosion echoing from the tunnel they'd left, and Elora stood, clutching the data crystal tightly. "They're blasting through," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Liam nodded, scanning the space for an exit, his suit's lights flickering weakly. The extremists were relentless, their shouts growing clearer, and the group had no choice but to keep moving. Liam took Elora's arm, guiding her toward a narrow passage ahead, his grip firm but careful, her cool scales sliding under his fingers. She didn't pull away, her steps matching his, and they pressed on, the tunnel walls closing in once more as the sound of pursuit reverberated behind them. The tunnel's narrow walls seemed to close tighter as Liam and Elora pushed deeper, the echoes of pursuit growing sharper behind them. The chamber they'd left was now a fading memory, replaced by the cold, damp stone pressing in from all sides. Elora's team stumbled along, their scales dulled with exhaustion, but the respite ended abruptly. A harsh shout rang out, followed by the clatter of boots, and the tunnel ahead flared with the glow of energy weapons. The extremists had caught up, their armored forms blocking the path, scales glinting ominously in the dim light. Liam skidded to a halt, pulling Elora behind him as the first blast scorched the wall near his head. "We're surrounded," he growled, his voice steady despite the odds, and the air thickened with the promise of violence. The fight erupted in a blur of motion. An extremist lunged, his weapon crackling with power, and Liam dodged, his adapted body moving with a speed that defied Xaeroth's gravity. Elora shouted a warning, her voice thrumming through the chaos, and Liam spun just as another attacker aimed at her. He threw himself forward, tackling her out of the line of fire, and they hit the ground hard, his arm sliding down her waist. His hand brushed the soft skin above her thigh, where scales parted like velvet, and a tremor ran through her, her breath shuddering through her scaled chest. Their eyes met, burning with intensity, a fleeting spark of heat flashing between them amid the lurch of life and death. She rolled free, her claws slashing at the air, and Liam surged to his feet, the moment etched into his senses. Liam fought like a force unleashed, his muscles rippling under the torn suit, every move a testament to his newfound strength. He grabbed an extremist's arm, twisting it until the weapon clattered free, and drove his fist into the alien's armored chest, cracking the silic plating. Sweat glistened on his skin, his frame tense with raw, masculine power, and Elora's luminous eyes followed him, wide with a mix of awe and something deeper, hunger, perhaps. She darted beside him, her own strikes precise, claws raking through gaps in the enemy's armor. Another extremist swung at Liam, and he ducked, slamming the attacker into the wall with a grunt, the impact reverberating through the tunnel. Elora's gaze lingered on him, her scales shimmering faintly, betraying her fascination with the human who'd become more than human. The skirmish raged, the tunnel a cacophony of grunts, clangs, and the hum of Elora's team scrambling for cover. Liam took a glancing blow to his shoulder, a sharp sting that drew a hiss from his lips, but he shook it off, his body adapting even to the pain. The extremists faltered, their numbers thinning under his relentless assault, and Elora moved in sync, her claws flashing as she disabled a weapon aimed at her wounded colleague. The last attacker fell with a thud, and silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Liam leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, and Elora stepped close, her eyes scanning him for damage. "You're hurt," she said, her voice low, and her fingers brushed his shoulder, tracing the torn suit slowly along his muscled arm. "Your body's so strange," she murmured, the resonance in her tone curling around him like an invitation, stirring an urge in him to pull her closer. He held her gaze, his breath steadying, the heat of her touch lingering on his skin. "Keeps me alive," he said, his voice rough, a faint grin tugging at his lips despite the ache. Her claws lingered, pressing lightly against his bicep, and her scales flickered with a subtle glow, her curiosity mingling with something warmer. The wound was shallow, a red streak across his shoulder, but her closeness, her cool fingers on his heated flesh, felt more intense than the fight itself. She pulled back reluctantly, her hand brushing his chest as she turned to check her team, and Liam flexed his arm, testing the pain, the memory of her touch seared into him. The group had survived, but the cost was clear. The three Xaerothians huddled together, their scales scratched and dull, their glowing eyes dim with despair. One clutched a bleeding arm, his voice a faint hum. "We can't keep this up," he said, his tone hollow. Another nodded, her scales gray with fatigue. "They'll find us again." Liam glanced at them, then at Elora, her presence a steady anchor amid their fading hope. She knelt beside the injured one, her claws gentle as she bound his wound, but her eyes flicked back to Liam, a silent acknowledgement of their shared strength. The extremists were beaten for now, but the tunnel stretched on, its shadows hiding more threats, and the weight of survival pressed heavier on them all. Liam moved to the fallen extremists, checking their gear for anything useful. He pried a small energy cell from a broken weapon, his hand steady despite the burn in his muscles, and tucked it into his belt. Elora watched him, her posture tense but graceful, the data crystal still clutched in her hand. "They won't stop," she said, her voice firm, though a flicker of exhaustion crept into it. Liam nodded, wiping sweat from his brow, his torn suit clinging to his frame. The fight had forged a bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, their reliance on each other sharpening with every passing moment. The Xaerothians' despair only made it clearer. Liam and Elora were the ones holding the group together, their connection a lifeline in the dark. The tunnel rumbled faintly, a distant tremor shaking loose dust from the ceiling, and Liam straightened, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. Elora stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his, the coolness of her scales a stark contrast to his heat. "We need to keep moving," he said, his tone low but resolute, and she nodded, her claws flexing as she adjusted her grip on the crystal. The group stirred, their movements sluggish, and Liam took the lead once more, his boots thudding softly on the stone floor, the faint hum of Elora's voice guiding them as they pressed deeper into the uncertain passage. The tunnel stretched on, its walls damp and cold, but the faint hum of machinery grew louder with each step. Liam led the way, his boots thudding softly against the stone, Elora close behind with her weary team trailing. The air shifted, carrying a sharp, electric tang, and Elora halted, her luminous eyes narrowing as she clutched the data crystal. She pressed it into a portable scanner, her claws tapping rapidly, and a holographic display flared to life, revealing a chilling schematic. "This is worse than I thought," she said, her voice thrumming with dread. "They're using the gravity amplifiers to destabilize Xaeroth's core. It's a plan to destroy the planet." Liam's jaw tightened, his green eyes flickering to the jagged tunnel ahead. "Then we stop them," he said, his tone hard, and the group exchanged grim nods, their resolve reignited despite their exhaustion. The schematic pointed to a hidden base, its entrance concealed beyond the tunnel's end. Liam and Elora took point, leaving the injured Xaerothians to guard their rear, their scales dulled but their eyes still glowing with trust. The passage narrowed into a crevice, barely wide enough for one, and Liam squeezed through first, his torn suit scraping the rock. Elora followed, her slender form pressing against him as they navigated the tight space. Her scales grazed his back, hard and cool, while her cold breath brushed his neck, sending a shiver down his spine that was equal parts danger and thrill. He could feel her closeness, the faint vibration of her voice, the smooth chill of her skin, and his pulse quickened, though he kept his focus on the faint light ahead, the base's entrance looming closer. They emerged into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with pulsing machinery, gravity amplifiers, their sleek surfaces humming with destructive power. Armored extremists patrolled the perimeter, their scales glinting under harsh lights, and Liam pulled Elora behind a stack of crates, their bodies pressed tight in the shadows. "We need to reach the central console," she whispered, her voice resonating against his ear, her claws brushing his arm as she pointed. He nodded, scanning the room, his adapted muscles coiling with readiness. The extremists were distracted, arguing over a control panel, and Liam signaled Elora to move, their steps silent as they slipped through the gaps between machines, the air crackling with tension. The console loomed ahead, a towering array of screens and controls, and Elora darted to it, her claws flying across the interface. Liam stood guard, his back to her, eyes tracking the patrols as they shifted closer. "Hurry," he muttered, his voice low, and she shot him a glance, her scales darkening with focus. "It's complex. Give me time," she replied, her tone sharp but strained. A sudden shout rang out. An extremist had spotted them, and Liam lunged, tackling the alien before he could fire. The fight was swift, his fists cracking armor, but more enemies closed in, their weapons charging with a menacing hum. Elora worked faster, her breath quickening, and Liam positioned himself between her and the threat, his hand brushing her hip as he steadied her against the console. The touch was accidental, but his fingers lingered on the cool, soft skin where her scales thinned, and he gripped tighter as a blast grazed his arm, the sting sharpening his senses. Elora's scales flickered, a faint tremor running through her, but she didn't falter, her claws tapping out commands under mounting pressure. Liam fought back the attackers, his strength surging as he shoved one into a machine, sparks flying from the impact. "Almost there," Elora said, her voice tight, and he glanced back, catching the intensity in her luminous eyes. Another extremist charged, and Liam blocked a strike, his arm burning. But he held his ground, the heat of battle mingling with the chill of her presence, so close behind him. The console beeped, a shrill alert cutting through the chaos, and Elora slammed a final key, her chest heaving. "It's done," she shouted, and the amplifiers whined, their hum faltering as the gravity waves began to stabilize. The extremists froze, their weapons lowering in confusion, and Liam turned to Elora, relief flooding him. She stepped forward, and without thinking, he pulled her into a fierce embrace, his hot, sweat-slicked body pressing against her cold, scaled frame. Her arms wrapped around him, her claws grazing his back, and the contrast, his heat, her chill, sent a shiver through them both, a raw, victorious connection pulsing between them. Her breath brushed his neck again, softer now, and he felt her scales shimmer against his chest, a fleeting moment of triumph in the fading roar of the machines. The chamber trembled as the amplifiers powered down, the air settling into an eerie calm. Liam released Elora, his hands lingering on her shoulders, and she met his gaze, her eyes glowing with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. The extremists retreated, their plan unraveling, and the remaining Xaerothians emerged from the tunnel, their scales brightening at the sight of stability. "You did it," one said, his voice thrumming with awe, but Elora shook her head, glancing at Liam. "We did it," she corrected, her tone firm yet warm. He wiped sweat from his brow, his torn suit clinging to his muscled frame, and flexed his arm, the shallow burn stinging but bearable. The base's lights flickered, casting long shadows across the machinery, and Liam scanned the room, his instincts still sharp. The amplifiers stood silent now, their threat neutralized, but the air carried a faint hum, a reminder of the power they'd wielded. Elora knelt by the console, checking its readings, her claws moving with precision, and Liam joined her, his shoulder brushing hers as he peered at the screen. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice low, and she nodded, her scales glinting faintly. "For now," she said, her resonant tones steadying the group. The Xaerothians gathered closer, their eyes darting between their leader and the human who defied their world, and Liam picked up a fallen tool, turning it over in his hands as the chamber's quiet hum filled the space around them. The chamber's silence deepened as the gravity amplifiers powered down completely, their once threatening hum reduced to a faint whisper. Liam turned the tool over in his hands, its cool metal grounding him, while Elora's team gathered around the console, their scales slowly regaining their luster. The extremists' retreat left a void, their scattered gear a testament to their defeat, and the air carried a sense of fragile calm. Word of the sabotage spread quickly, transmitted through the outpost's restored comms, and within hours, Xaerothian authorities descended on the base, their armored forms sweeping through to secure the site. The political fallout was swift. Councils convened, factions dissolved, and the extremist group responsible for the disaster faced dismantlement, their influence crumbling under the weight of their failed plan. Liam stood amidst the aftermath, his torn suit clinging to his sweat-slicked frame, his newly dense muscles aching but strong. The Xaerothians who'd survived the ordeal, both Elora's team and those rescued earlier, watched him with a mix of reverence and disbelief. "He's not like other humans," one murmured, his scales shimmering as he studied Liam's broad shoulders, the power rippling beneath his skin. Another nodded, her glowing eyes wide. "He's one of us now, adapted." The praise spread beyond the tunnels, reaching the outpost and beyond, and soon Liam became a symbol of resilience, a human who'd bent Xaeroth's brutal forces to his will. Elora, standing nearby, observed him quietly, her luminous eyes tracing his form with a flicker of admiration that warmed her otherwise cool demeanor. The outpost buzzed with activity as the crisis faded, its reinforced walls now a hub of recovery and reflection. Liam and Elora were summoned to a gathering, a mix of human scientists and Xaerothian leaders, where their actions were hailed as a turning point. The crowd parted as they entered, eyes following them, and Elora stepped closer to Liam, her claws brushing his shoulder before the assembly. Her touch was firm, lingering, and her gaze locked onto his, pride and a quiet hunger shimmering in her luminous depths. "You've changed everything," she said, her resonant voice low, meant for him alone, and the heat of her look stirred him, a silent echo of their closeness in the tunnels. He grinned faintly, his hand brushing hers in return, and the onlookers murmured, seeing them not just as saviors but as a bridge between their kinds. Their bond, forged in danger, became a beacon of possibility. The humans clapped Liam on the back, their voices loud with congratulations, while the Xaerothians hummed in their resonant tones, their scales brightening with hope. "They stopped the end of our world," a Xaerothian elder said, his voice thrumming through the room, and a human scientist nodded, "and showed us we can work together." The event sparked new talks, agreements for shared research, joint expeditions, a future where Earth and Xaeroth could stand as allies. Liam and Elora's partnership inspired it all, their connection a living proof of what could be achieved when two species leaned on each other's strengths. The gathering stretched into the evening, the amber sky outside softening to a muted glow. Liam stood near a viewport, his shoulders still tender from the fight, and Elora joined him, her presence a cool contrast to the room's warmth. She reached out, her claws tracing the line of his arm where muscle met scar, and her scales shimmered faintly, betraying her fascination. "Your body, it's remarkable," she said, her voice a soft hum, and her touch lingered, stirring that familiar heat in him. He met her gaze, his green eyes steady. "Yours isn't so bad either," he replied, his tone rough but playful, and her scales flickered, a rare hint of amusement crossing her features. The crowd's noise faded behind them, their moment a quiet island amid the celebration. The Xaerothians in the room watched them, their awe growing into something like inspiration. "He's stronger than we thought possible," one whispered, his scales shifting to a bright teal, and another nodded. "And she chose him to stand with her." The humans, too, took note, their chatter filled with plans. New suits based on Liam's adaptation, experiments to replicate his change. Elora pulled her hand back, but her eyes stayed on him, a silent promise lingering in their glow, and Liam flexed his hand, feeling the power still coursing through him. A gift from Xaeroth he hadn't asked for but now owned. The elder approached, his scales a deep emerald, and handed Elora a small device, a communicator linked to the councils. "You'll guide what comes next," he said, his voice resonating with authority, and she nodded, her grip tightening on the crystal data still tucked against her chest. Liam stood beside her, his presence solid, and the elder's eyes flicked to him, a rare approval in his gaze. The room hummed with energy, plans unfolding, and Liam glanced out the viewport again, the planet's rugged surface stretching into the dusk. Elora shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his, and they turned to face the crowd together, her claws tapping the communicator as voices rose around them, shaping the future step by step. The gathering dispersed as night settled over the outpost, the amber sky fading to a deep bronze. Liam lingered near the viewport, his gaze tracing Xaeroth's rugged expanse, its harsh beauty now a part of him. The councils had offered him a return to Earth, a hero's welcome, a chance to rest, but the thought felt hollow. His body had changed, forged by this planet's trials, and his mind kept drifting to Elora, her presence a pull stronger than gravity itself. She approached him quietly, her scales glinting in the soft light, and rested a clawed hand on his arm. "Stay," she said, her resonant voice low, a simple word carrying a world of meaning. Liam met her luminous eyes, his decision settling like stone. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, and the outpost hummed around them, its future tied to theirs. Days later, they stood in a private chamber, a small space carved into the outpost's core, its walls smooth and cool. Liam had shed the torn suit for a thin tunic, its fabric clinging to his muscled frame, and Elora faced him, her slender form close enough to feel her chill. She stepped nearer, her claws tracing a slow path from his shoulder down his chest, the sharp tips grazing the cloth and leaving a tingling trail on his skin. His breath hitched, and he reached out, pulling her against him, her cold scales pressing into his heated body. The contrast sent a shiver through them both, a raw, electric connection that pulsed in the quiet. Her scales shimmered faintly, her eyes glowing with a mix of curiosity and desire, and he felt the weight of their journey in every touch. Elora tilted her head, exposing the soft patch beneath her neck where scales parted like silk, a rare vulnerability in her armored form. Liam's hand moved instinctively, his rough fingers brushing the smooth, cool skin, and a thrill ran through him, an urge to explore more tugging at his restraint. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice rough with awe, and her scales flickered, a silent response. She leaned in, her breath cool against his lips, and their eyes locked, hers a blend of challenge and tenderness, his burning with need. Their kiss was deep, fierce, a collision of heat and cold that melted the space between them. Her claws tightened on his shoulders, his hands firm on her hips, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of their shared pulse. They pulled apart slowly, breath mingling in the dim light, and Elora rested her forehead against his, her scales cool against his flushed skin. "This changes everything," she said, her voice thrumming softly, and Liam nodded, his grin faint but sure. "Good," he replied, his hand still resting on that soft patch, feeling her steady beneath his touch. The chamber's quiet wrapped around them, a sanctuary carved from chaos. And they stood there, two beings from different worlds now bound by something stronger than science or survival. Outside, Xaeroth's winds howled, but within these walls, their connection was a quiet force, unshakable and alive. The days that followed saw them dive into new work. Liam's adaptation became the focus of study, a bridge between human and Xaerothian potential. He trained with scientists, his dense muscles tested under controlled gravity, while Elora led the research, her sharp mind unraveling the secrets of his change. They worked side by side, their movements synced, her claws brushing his arm in passing moments that lingered longer each time. The outpost thrived, its labs bustling with humans and Xaerothians, their collaboration fueled by the pair who defied the planet's wrath. Whispers of their bond spread. Some called it partnership, others love, but to Liam and Elora, it was both a fusion of trust and longing that grew with every shared glance. The Xaerothians watched Liam with growing respect, their scales brightening in his presence, while humans marveled at Elora's grace, her intellect a match for his strength. Together, they became more than symbols. They were a promise, a vision of harmony etched into Xaeroth's future. The Council's planned expeditions, new outposts, a network of cooperation stretching beyond the planet's copper skies. Liam and Elora stood at its heart, their hands brushing as they reviewed data, their quiet moments a counterpoint to the bustle around them. The planet's storms raged on, but its people, human and Xaerothian, looked to them, inspired by a bond that had turned disaster into hope. One evening, they returned to the chamber, its walls now familiar, and Liam leaned against the viewport, Xaeroth's dusk painting the room in bronze hues. Elora joined him, her claws tapping a rhythm on the crystal data she still carried, a memento of their fight. "We've built something here," she said, her voice resonating with quiet pride, and he turned to her, his green eyes steady. "We're just getting started," he replied, pulling her close, her coolness grounding his heat. They stood together, gazing out at the planet they'd saved, their future unfolding in the shadows of its storms. And as Xaeroth's winds sang their endless song, Liam and Elora held fast to each other, a love born of struggle and sealed in triumph, a beacon for two species now forever entwined.